Daniel Calloway was 41 years old. The kind of man who answered every email within the hour and had never once been late to a job site walkthrough in 19 years of practice. He drove the same gray pickup he'd bought used in 2014. The dashboard cracked along the seam where the Pittsburgh sun hit it every July. On a Thursday morning in October, a process server and a Navy windbreaker found him in the parking lot outside Calloway Structural Group's offices at 7:18 a.m. and handed him an envelope before he'd finished locking his truck. Inside was a divorce petition. His wife of 11 years, Vanessa, had filed it the afternoon before. He read the caption page once, standing in the cold, and put it in his jacket pocket. 40 minutes later, his phone rang. It was his attorney. The acquisition had closed overnight, the deal that converted Daniel's 31% stake in the company into something just over $28 billion. Vanessa didn't know that yet. She had filed believing she was walking away from a modest house, 2 paid-off vehicles, and a husband who worked too much for too little. She had no idea what she had already set in motion. Before we go any further, drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. The Calloway structural offices smelled like fresh coffee and cut lumber that morning, same as every morning, when Daniel set his keys on the desk and looked at the envelope a second time. Daniel had spent 19 years building a reputation in an industry where a missed deadline cost more than a missed paycheck. He drove that same gray pickup with 161,000 miles on it. He wore steel-toed boots he'd resoled twice rather than replace, because they'd finally broken in right. Every morning at 5:40 he made coffee in the same dented percolator his father had used on job sites in the 80s. And he drank the first cup standing at the kitchen window before anyone else in the house was awake. He was the kind of man who returned calls the same day, even when the news on the other end was bad. 11 years earlier, when Vanessa was finishing her real estate license and the market hadn't given her a single client yet, he had covered her tuition, her marketing materials, and 4 months of rent on an office she shared with 2 other agents, out of a salary he'd deferred to keep his own company solvent through the recession. He hadn't told her that part. He'd just paid it. He had no idea, that Thursday morning, that while he was deferring his own salary to build something worth keeping, Vanessa had already decided what she needed instead. Then came the knock from a man in a windbreaker holding a clipboard. After that, nothing in Daniel's week operated the way he'd planned it. The light in the kitchen was going amber by the time Vanessa's car pulled into the driveway that evening, the engine idling a beat longer than it needed to before she cut it. Daniel was at the table, the envelope from that morning lying flat in front of him. She came in through the side door, the way she always had, holding her keys in one hand and a folder of her own in the other. She'd dressed for it, the gray blazer she wore to closings. She'd clearly rehearsed. "I wanted to be the one to explain it," she said, setting the folder on the counter, not the table. "Before you heard it some other way." He looked at her. He didn't say anything yet. "I've given this a lot of thought," she said. "Longer than you probably realize. I need something more than what this is, Daniel. I owe it to myself to be honest about that." He looked at the folder she hadn't opened, then back at her. "I'm not doing this to hurt you," she said. "I know how that sounds. But staying in something just because it's comfortable isn't the same as it being right." He set down the coffee mug he'd been holding since before she walked in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask the obvious question, the one about how long, or with whom, or since when. He'd learned a long time ago that a man who asks a question he already suspects the answer to is just delaying the part where he has to hear it. "The house," he said. 6 words. You'll want the house. I think that's fair, she said, given everything. He noticed, on the counter beside her folder, a business card he didn't recognize. Creamstock, raised lettering. The name Hail Meridian across the top in a typeface, too polished for a referral. He didn't ask about it. He filed it the way he filed a materials discrepancy on a job site, without alarm, without conclusion. Not yet. I know this is a lot to process today, of all days, she said, and there was something almost rehearsed in the apology, the kind that explains itself rather than the thing it's apologizing for. I'm sorry you're having to deal with this right now. He picked up the envelope from that morning, folded it once, and put it back in his jacket pocket. He didn't tell her what was in it. I'll have my attorney call yours, he said. He walked to the door. He needed the cold air, the truck, 20 minutes of driving with the radio off before he let himself think about any of it. 2 years before that, Callaway Structural had been 3 men in a rented office above a tire shop in Homestead, splitting one truck and a single line of credit between them. Daniel had stayed when his 2 partners wanted out, buying their shares with money he didn't have and a payment plan that stretched across 6 years. He deferred his own salary for 18 months running, working weekend consults just to keep the lights on at home. Vanessa had been finishing her license that same stretch. He'd covered the tuition, the marketing packets, 4 months of a shared office downtown. He drove 40 minutes each way most evenings to drop off open house signs she didn't have time to pick up herself, then drove back and worked until midnight on a structural assessment due the next morning. He never mentioned the drive. He never mentioned any of it. He had noticed, about a year before the papers came, that she'd started staying later at showings that didn't quite match the listings she'd told him about. A new gym membership. A second phone she kept face down on the counter. He had told himself it was the market. Real estate ran on odd hours, and she'd worked hard to build the book of business she had. He extended the kind of good faith a man extends when he spent his whole life trusting that structures hold if you built them right. Eleanor Voss, who'd kept the books at Callaway Structural since the tire shop days, had told him once, years earlier, during the worst stretch of the recession, that most owners would have sold and walked the day it got hard. He hadn't. She'd said it like it was simply a fact she'd observed, not a compliment. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. That was the part Vanessa had never bothered to find out. Not what he'd built, but what it had cost him to keep building it while she wasn't looking. She had married a man with a rented office and a truck that wouldn't start in February. She left a man whose company a national infrastructure firm had just spent 4 years trying to acquire. Somewhere in between, she had stopped asking what the work actually involved. Her name was Eleanor Voss. She'd been Callaway Structural's controller for 14 years, the same 14 years Daniel had run the place. And she hadn't said a word about any of it until 3 days after the divorce papers arrived. Not because she hadn't noticed. She'd been waiting for him to be in a place to hear it. She asked him into the small conference room that Monday morning, then closed the door. Something she never did. She had a manila folder in front of her, the edges worn soft from handling. I'm going to lay this out in sequence, she said. I need you to let me get through all of it before you respond. He nodded. She opened the folder. The first record was dated 14 months earlier, a home equity line of credit drawn against the house, $170,000. His signature on the original application from years before still attached, but no new authorization from him on this draw. A second draw dated 5 months after the first for another $170,000. $340,000 total, moved out of an account he'd assumed had gone dormant after they'd refinanced. He looked at the dates. He recognized the second one. It was the week Vanessa had told him she needed space to think after a fight about nothing in particular. He said nothing. "There's more," Eleanor said. She slid a wire transfer record across the table. Both draws had gone, within 9 days of being withdrawn, into an account belonging to an entity called Hale Meridian Holdings, LLC. He thought of the card on the kitchen counter, the cream stock, the raised lettering. He hadn't reached a conclusion about it that night. He reached one now. "Who's Hale?" he said. Not a question with much air in it. "Preston Hale," said Marcus Donnelly, Daniel's attorney, who joined them by then with a coffee he hadn't touched. "Developer. He's got a 68-unit condominium project under construction in Lawrenceville called the Meridian. Construction loan is $11.4 million through First Allegheny Capital. He's been telling investors the project is fully collateralized." "It isn't," Eleanor said. Donnelly turned a page. "The $340,000 from your equity line appears in Hale Meridian's capital contribution ledger as an investor deposit. Vanessa's name isn't on it directly. It's listed under a holding entity she registered in March of last year, 11 months before she filed." Daniel sat with that for a moment. A short silence. One grounding action. He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on the table, the way he'd straighten a level on a sawhorse, more out of habit than need. "When did she register the entity?" he asked. "March 14th, Donnelly said. "Same week she told you a listing in Squirrel Hill had fallen through." "That," Eleanor said quietly, "is exactly what we're going to confirm." Donnelly laid out one more page, a registration filing, and a co-signer's line beneath it. Preston Hale's name was there too, dated the same week. This wasn't a decision Vanessa had made in a single evening with a folder and a rehearsed line. It had been built in pieces for the better part of a year before she ever sat down at his kitchen table. Daniel looked at the record for a long time. Then, he stood and moved around to the far side of the table, where he could see all 3 documents spread out together: the equity draws, the wire transfers, the LLC filing. He approached it the way he approached a set of structural plans on a difficult job, not fixing on any single sheet first, just scanning until the connections between the pieces resolved into a shape. He could see it now, how one decision had fed the next, and the next, long before he'd had any idea a decision was even being made. "She used my equity line," he said, "to fund another man's construction loan." "That's what the record shows," Donnelly said. "And the divorce filing?" "Comes 11 months after the second draw," Donnelly said. "After the entity was already built. After the funds were already placed." He closed the folder. This wasn't the end of a marriage that fell apart. It was the last step in something that had already been under construction for a long time. He didn't act immediately. Donnelly had started pulling records 6 weeks before the papers were even filed. Not because he'd suspected anything specific, but because Daniel had asked him, almost a year earlier, to review the trust structure tied to his equity stake as a routine piece of estate planning, long before any acquisition was on the table. Donnelly found that the irrevocable trust had been funded with Daniel's shares back in 2019, 5 years before Vanessa filed, which meant that whatever the stake eventually came to be worth, it had stopped being marital property the day it went into the trust. He'd called Daniel at 6:10 that Friday morning, because that was the hour the work got done. A forensic accountant named Priya Anand spent the better part of 2 weeks going through Hale Meridian's loan file, the LLC's capital ledger, and First Allegheny Capital's underwriting documents. What she found was more complete than Daniel had expected. The $340,000 wasn't simply an undisclosed investment. It had been represented to First Allegheny as Vanessa and Preston Hale's combined personal capital, used to satisfy a loan condition requiring 20% of the project's equity to come from the principal's own funds, not borrowed money. It wasn't their own funds. It had come out of a home equity line secured against a house Daniel still half owned, drawn without his knowledge or his signature. Vanessa called on a Tuesday. Daniel let it go to voicemail. She called again 20 minutes later. The second message had a different register than the first. The composure she'd carried into the kitchen that night had developed an edge. "I'm hearing things," she said in the message, "and I'd really appreciate it if you'd stop letting people put ideas in your head before we've even had a real conversation about this." He listened to both messages once. He noted the shift. He filed it. He didn't move fast. That was the part Vanessa had never managed to account for in 11 years of marriage and however many months of planning her exit. She had spent a long time deciding what kind of man she was dealing with, and she had gotten the central thing wrong. She'd read his patience as the edge of what he was capable of. It wasn't the edge. It was the skill he'd spent 19 years building, the same one that let him hold a job site together through a 6-month permitting delay without losing a single subcontractor. She had simply never had reason to watch it in motion before. 3 weeks after Eleanor closed the conference room door, Daniel called Vanessa himself. His voice was level, almost collaborative. "I think we can resolve this without dragging it through a courtroom," he said. "I'd like to sit down. My attorney's office, Thursday." "I'd like that too," she said. And he could hear the relief she wasn't quite managing to keep out of her voice. Relief that told him she still believed this would go the way she'd planned it. "I think that's the mature way to handle it." "Thursday then," he said, and ended the call. Donnelly, across the table, had been watching him the whole time. "She thinks it's already resolved," Daniel said. Donnelly didn't say anything. He just opened his laptop and started building the agenda for Thursday. Daniel reached Donnelly's offices 11 minutes before anyone was expected. He preferred it that way. The conference room on the 14th floor had a long walnut table and a wall of glass looking out over the rivers. And at that hour the morning light came in flat and even, the kind of light that made every surface in the room look like evidence. Donnelly arrived at 9:50, followed by Priya Anand with a single banker's box. They laid documents out along one side of the table, the unhurried arrangement of people who'd done this before and weren't nervous about it. Vanessa came in at 10 exactly, her attorney a step behind her. She dressed the way she had the night she'd come to the house, composed, prepared, the gray blazer again. She looked at Daniel once, a quick professional nod, then turned her attention to Donnelly, as though Daniel were simply a party to a meeting she expected to manage. "Before we get into terms," her attorney began, "I want to say we're hoping today can move things toward a resolution that's fair too. There are several matters that need acknowledgement first," Donnelly said, "before any discussion of terms." He opened the folder and set the first document on the table. Unhurried, on March 14th of last year, Vanessa Calloway registered Hale Meridian Holdings, LLC, as a capital investor in a 68-unit residential development. Between June and November, $340,000 was drawn from a home equity line secured against the marital residence, a line requiring both owners' authorization. Mr. Calloway did not authorize either draw. He let a moment pass. That money was represented to the project's primary lender, First Allegheny Capital, as personal capital contributed by the principals. It was not. A civil claim has already been filed. Vanessa's attorney looked down at the page in front of him. Whatever ease he'd arrived with had gone out of his posture. Priya placed the second document down, the wire transfer trace, the 2 installments, the dates lined up beside the LLC filing. Donnelly walked through it without drama, the way a man reads a level. The transfer from the equity line to Hale Meridian's operating account. 2 installments, 6 days behind each LLC filing milestone. The receiving account is controlled by Preston Hale. The funds financed 20% of the equity requirement on his construction loan. Vanessa's expression hadn't moved. The effort of keeping it still was visible to anyone looking closely. Daniel was looking closely. "I want to be precise about what we're presenting and what we're not," Donnelly said. "We're not making any representation today about criminal exposure. We're confirming that this documentation exists, that it's preserved, and that it will form part of the record going forward, including in any proceeding First Allegheny brings regarding the misrepresented collateral on Mr. Hale's loan." "That's not what this is," Vanessa said. The first thing she'd said since sitting down. "There's one more item," Donnelly said, and set down the trust filing. Mr. Callaway's equity in Callaway Structural Group was placed in an irrevocable trust in 2019, 5 years before this petition was filed. The acquisition that closed last month increased the value of that trust. It did not change its character. It was separate property before the filing. It remains separate property now. The room went quiet for what felt like a long stretch. Daniel counted 9 seconds. "We'll allow time for review," Donnelly said. Daniel stood. He hadn't brought anything to the table beyond the one folder Donnelly had prepared, and it had done what it needed to do. He buttoned his jacket. He shook Donnelly's hand, then Priya's. He walked toward the door. He stopped. He turned back. He spoke to Vanessa directly, not loudly, not for the room. For her. "You thought I left that kitchen broken," he said. "I left it clear." He walked out. He didn't look back. It didn't unravel in a single week. By December, First Allegheny Capital had frozen further disbursements on the Meridian construction loan, pending its own review of the misrepresented collateral, and Preston Hale's framing crew started missing payroll. 2 subcontractors walked off the job in January. Vanessa's real estate clients, a fair number of them referred over the years through Daniel's industry contacts, stopped calling. Word moves quietly, but completely through an industry that size. She was carrying what she'd chosen to carry, and it didn't announce itself dramatically. It was just constant, a missed payment, then another, the kind of weight that doesn't break a person all at once. Daniel, in the meantime, was building something. He wasn't in a hurry about it. He never had been. His name went on the paperwork for a new structural engineering scholarship at the local university that fall, funded out of the trust, named for nobody in particular. Callaway Structural, still run day-to-day exactly the way he'd always run it, took on a transit bridge contract that summer, with a scope larger than anything he'd signed in 19 years. He had 31 people working under him by spring, a 32nd starting in June. He returned every message the same day. He gave timelines and met them. 14 months after the conference room on the 14th floor, Daniel's office had moved 2 floors up into a corner space with the same dented percolator sitting on a side table, still the one his father had used. A framed copy of the original 2019 trust filing hung beside his desk, not for the dollar figure attached to it, but because Eleanor had pointed out, the day they hung it, that it had been signed 5 years before any of this started, back when nobody but the 2 of them, and a lawyer believed it would ever be worth defending. He kept the same boots, resold a 3rd time that spring. Vanessa moved out of the rental she'd taken near the Meridian site by that autumn. The project was still listed as Phase 1, paused, the following year. On a clear October morning, almost exactly 2 years after the divorce was finalized, Daniel stood on the deck of the new transit bridge his crew was finishing ahead of schedule, coffee from the same percolator going cold in his hand. Below him, the crew was setting the last span. Eleanor's office light was already on across the river. Somewhere behind him, a junior engineer was double-checking a weld he'd already checked twice himself, the way Daniel had taught him to. He finished the coffee. He set the cup down on the railing and walked the length of the deck once, slowly, the way he always did before signing off on a section. He didn't think about the kitchen counter, or the folder, or the card with the raised lettering. There wasn't much left of any of it to think about. He picked up his level, crouched beside the last connection point, and checked it. Steady, he stood, signed the inspection sheet, and kept walking. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've got 2 more picked out that I think you'll really enjoy.